Have you ever really thought about how uh, these big policy decisions, the ones about budgets and things, how quickly they can actually affect real people miles away?
It's quite something, isn't it? How a change in, say, government spending here can have these immediate, very tangible consequences elsewhere.
Exactly. And today, that's what we're digging into. We're looking at the UK's recent decision, the one to, well, reduce its foreign aid budget.
Right. And our main source for this is, interestingly, the UK government's own report. It's called an Equality Impact Assessment, put out by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the FCDO.
Okay.
But we're also looking at, statements from aid groups and what a government minister has said just to get a rounded view.
Got it. So the plan today is to really unpack what these cuts mean, like on the ground. Who's feeling the impact most, and what are the different sides saying about this whole shift, all based on these sources you've brought.
Exactly. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's set the scene first. Labor announced this cut earlier in the year, yeah.
That's taking the aid budget from 0.5% of national income down to 0.3%. That's quite a drop.
It is, and the reason they've given, according to the sources, is needing the money for increased defense spending.
Right, defense. But this 0.5% figure itself wasn't the original target, was it?
No, not at all. And that's where the history is kind of interesting. The previous Labor government had actually committed to 0.7% of national income for aid. There was a big international target, lots of cross-party support back then.
0.7%.
Then Rishi Sunak, during the pandemic, cut it down to the 0.5% we just mentioned.
Right.
And now this latest move to 0.3%. And what's really telling is that the development minister, Jenny Chapman, she actually called this 0.3% the new normal.
The new normal. Wow. That sounds permanent.
It certainly suggests a potential long-term shift, yeah.
Ugh.
Not just a temporary measure, but maybe a whole new baseline for the UK's role in international development, a real departure.
So, okay, they've cut the overall pot significantly. But they must still be spending something. Where are the priorities now? What areas are still getting funded? Well, the sources, especially the FCDO assessment, they point to continued support for big multilateral organizations. Think the World Bank's International Development Association, the IDA.
Right, the IDA. They do the big loans and grants.
Exactly. And also GAVI, the Global Vaccines Initiative, plus general humanitarian support is still funded.
Okay.
And the FCDO assessment itself actually says that focusing on these areas has, quote, protected against disproportionate impacts on equalities, but specifically in those areas.
Ah, so it's a targeted protection. It sounds like they're choosing these big global institutions, maybe for broader impact, but potentially sacrificing some direct country-level support.
That seems to be the implication. Because when you look at the other part of the FCDO's assessment, the bit about direct country-to-country bilateral aid, that's where you really see the impact of the cuts.
Okay, so what does it say?
Well, take health. Spending is being cut on things like women's health, strengthening local health systems, even health emergency response.
Where specifically?
The report names the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Ethiopia. And there's this specific program, the Ending Preventable Deaths Support Program, that's facing reduction and prioritization, their words, across 11 countries.
11 countries. And does the report say what the likely outcome of reducing health spending is?
It's pretty blunt, actually. It says, and I'm quoting here, overall, any reductions to health spending risk an increase in disease burden and ultimately in deaths, impacting in particular those living in poverty, women, children, and people with disabilities.
Wow, that's stark. Coming from their own assessment.
Yeah,
Increase in disease and increase in deaths. It acknowledges it right there. Does it offer any way they plan to, lessen that immediate impact? Or is it just presented as the cost?
It's largely presented as a consequence, yeah. A direct trade-off from the budget decision. And it's not just health. The assessment then talks about education.
Okay.
It mentions in-year reductions to education spend. So cuts happening now in Ethiopia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe. And there's one really specific, quite impactful example they give. The early closure of a girls' education program in the DRC. It was meant to run longer, but it's closing early in 2025-26.
An early closure. How many children does that affect?
The assessment quantifies it. It says this will have, quote, negative impacts on 170,000 children in post-conflict rural Kasai.
170,000 children in a post-conflict area, just from closing that one program early.
Yes, and it specifically mentions the impact on the most vulnerable and children with disabilities within that group.
That number, 170,000.
Mhm.
It really puts a human face on these budget lines, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And there's another detail in the assessment that sort of reinforces this point. It says that out of 13 programs, current or planned, that are now earmarked for closure, 11 of them were specifically equalities focused.
11 out of 13. Focus on equalities. That seems disproportionate. Does the assessment explain why those particular programs are getting cut? Is it a deliberate move away from equality goals or something else?
Well, the assessment points out that these kinds of equalities-focused programs often depend heavily on that direct country-to-country funding, the bilateral aid we mentioned.
Ah, I see.
So when the overall budget shrinks and the priority shifts more towards those big multilateral agencies.
Those direct bilateral programs become more vulnerable to cuts. Okay, that makes sense structurally, even if the impact is concerning.
Exactly.
So, given all this, how are people reacting? What are the different viewpoints we're seeing in the sources? Let's start with the NGOs, the aid organizations.
Well, they're deeply concerned, as you'd expect. Lisa Wise from Save the Children UK put it very strongly. She said, "The government has confirmed our worst fears. Significant reductions in aid spending will result in deaths of the world's most vulnerable, including children."
Strong words.
Very. She acknowledged the World Bank funding is welcome, but she argued for a strategy based on actual need, not just, quote, balancing the books.
Right. Anyone else?
Yeah, Gideon Rabinowitz from Bond, that's the network for UK development NGOs, he echoed that. He said, "The world's most marginalized communities, particularly those experiencing conflict, and women and girls will pay the highest price for these political choices." And he also made a point about needing these impact assessments more often, not just for the current year, because the effects will obviously be longer term.
Okay, so that's the NGO perspective. Deep concern about the human costs, especially for vulnerable groups. What about the government side? How do they frame this?
Well, the development minister, Jenny Chapman, she presents it as a modernization. She said, "We are modernizing our approach. Every pound must work harder for UK taxpayers and the people we help."
Yeah.
And these figures show how we are starting to do just that through having a clear focus and priorities.
A focus and priorities.
Yeah.
And does she elaborate on what that new approach looks like?
Yeah, she talks about the UK moving towards, quote, "a new relationship with developing countries, becoming partners and investors rather than acting as a traditional aid donor."
Partners and investors instead of a traditional aid donor. That's
Yeah.
interesting phrasing.
It is, and it's worth just quickly noting this isn't happening in a vacuum, globally speaking.
How so?
Well, think back to the Trump administration in the U.S. They also brought in really sweeping cuts to American foreign aid.
Right, I remember that.
And one example was the abrupt stopping of funding for life-saving HIV drug programs in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So this UK shift is part of a perhaps broader trend among some developed nations rethinking their aid commitments.
Okay, so wrapping this up then, what this deep dive really seems to show us, based on the government's own assessment and what aid groups are saying, is just how quickly these big budget decisions, well, they hit home. They have immediate real-world consequences for some of the most vulnerable people.
It's definitely complex. You've got this balancing act between, what a country sees as its national priorities and its global responsibilities. But as we've seen laid out pretty clearly, the impacts on the ground are undeniable and, in some cases, quite severe.
It leaves you with a question, doesn't it? When a government talks about becoming partners and investors instead of a traditional aid donor, which sounds, potentially positive in the long run, how do you square that idea with the immediate needs of those 170,000 children losing their education program, or those 11 countries facing health program cuts, all highlighted in the government's own report? What does real partnership actually look like when faced with consequences like that? Something to think about.